Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Star Drive, the true story of a genius, an engine, and our future, by Phillip Hills, narrated by Tom Perkins. Prologue. In February 1990, when Voyager 1 finally left the heliosphere and was nearly 4 billion miles from home, it sent back photos of the Earth as seen from the edge of the solar system. It appeared as a pale blue dot in an immensity of darkness. Never before had humankind been given such a perspective on the planet which we call home. In the far future, we may look back on this moment with something of the emotion that Europeans felt in the century after they discovered the Americas. For we can be fairly confident that, if we survive, this will be seen as the beginning of our species' liberation from our planetary origins. The exploration of the solar system has been made possible by the greatest concentration of technological innovation our planet has seen, and the leader of that effort for the last 30 years or so has been NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration of the United States. Most people who have any interest in space exploration are aware of this. What few people know is that at the core of the project, and essential to its future success, is an engine which will power all the functions of the spacecraft. It does this by converting the heat of a nuclear fission reactor directly into electricity. The engine was invented more than 2 centuries ago by a Scottish minister of the Kirk called Robert Stirling, and the Stirling engines which spacecraft will now carry are not so different from the drawings which young Robert made when he applied to patent it in 1816. In May of 2018, NASA called a press conference to announce the successful test run of their KRUSTY machine. They explained that KRUSTY was an acronym for an electricity generator to be used for manned bases on the Moon and the nearer planets, and for distant space missions, all of which require a compact, reliable, and small source of electrical power. The output of solar photovoltaic cells falls off beyond Jupiter, and radioisotope generators don't produce enough power to run a dishwasher. All starships will need a dishwasher. KRUSTY will provide support for life on satellites and planets and, eventually, propulsion beyond the solar system. KRUSTY stands for Kilopower Reactor Using Stirling Technology. The first part of the acronym is largely self-explanatory. A kilopower reactor is a very small nuclear reactor which produces heat sufficient to generate a few kilowatts of electricity. This doesn't sound much, given the scale of the ambition, and 1,000,000 times less than you would expect from a normal nuclear power station. But it's a lot more than astronauts have been used to until now. But what about using Stirling technology? Technology we know about, but what has it got to do with the name of a town in central Scotland? The answer, of course, is that the thing uses the engine invented by Robert Stirling, and named after him, to convert the heat of the reactor into electricity. So, an engine on which humanity's greatest enterprise depends was invented by a Scotsman more than 200 years ago. How astonishing! You could be forgiven for wondering why you have never heard of him or his engine. A few people have, of course, and the engine is well known to enthusiasts around the world. But if you stop people on the street in Scotland and ask them, you will find they know nothing about it. I can tell you this is the case. I have tried it. The book which follows is about that engine and about the people, many of them very remarkable, who have brought it to the point at which it can be installed on a spaceship and expected to run non-stop without repairs or maintenance of any sort for tens, perhaps hundreds of years. Since the Stirling engine is the only known way of producing an appreciable quantity of long-term electrical power on a spacecraft, and all feasible ways of propelling a starship require electricity, it is reasonable to believe that when a spacecraft from this planet finally makes it to one of the nearer stars, its systems and its propulsion will be thanks to the power from the Stirling engine. Truly a star drive. Introduction. The Portobello Road. One fine Friday morning many years ago, Dick and I walked over to the Portobello Road. It is an undistinguished thoroughfare in North London, undistinguished save on Friday mornings when there is a street market, and it is transformed into something magical. In the market are sold fruit and fish, falafels and hot dogs, old clothes and miscellaneous junk. There is a distinction in the matter of junk, for at the South End it aspires to the status of antiques, while at the North there is no such pretension. Needless to say, the North End is the more interesting. Having walked the length of the road that Friday, Dick and I stopped by a stall whose merchandise, unusually for the South End, appeared to be of a technical and mechanical nature. On the ground, for the stall was heavily laden, lay a curious little machine. "What's that?" I asked the stall-holder. "Some kind of model steam engine," he replied. "May I lift it onto the stall?" I asked. "Sure," he said. I picked up the device and sat it on a space which the chap had obligingly cleared. It was surprisingly heavy, about 2 feet long, and evidently made of cast iron. There were 2 parallel cylinders joined by a pipe, and one of the cylinders had a frill of what appeared to be cooling fins. Rods emerging from the cylinders connected to a shaft which carried a small flywheel. I gently turned the flywheel, and one of the rods went in and the other out. "I don't think it's a steam engine," I said. Dick was looking closely at it. "I don't recognize it at all," he ventured. "What do you think it is?" I hesitated. It's never a good idea to be too forthcoming if a negotiation is in view and the guy you are to negotiate with is listening closely. Another customer came by, and the stall-holder transferred his attention. "I think maybe it's a Stirling engine," I said. "What's that?" Dick asked. I frowned. "I'm not sure. I've never seen one in the flesh, only read about them. They were common a century or more ago. I think if that bit," I pointed to the end of one of the cylinders, "is heated, the thing will run." "On just heat?" Dick asked. "How's that?" "I don't know," I rather lamely replied. This was a shaming moment, for both of us had some experience of machinery. The stall-holder turned back to us. "Well?" he asked. I took the plunge. "How much do you want for it?" I asked. 240, he said very positively. I forget what exactly I replied, but I must have expressed incredulity. The dealer continued. "This is not just amateur rubbish," he said. "You can see it's museum-quality stuff." I could indeed. The iron castings, though heavy, were of a delicacy which it would be difficult now to replicate, and the fettling and machining were faultless. The dealer continued, "And I paid a bloke 220 for it yesterday, and I'll be happy to take 20 on it." This carried conviction. I had been around antique dealers for many years, and I knew that the serious and successful traders were those who kept their capital working by accepting small margins. In a scurry of mental gymnastics, I tried to balance desire with the prospect of domestic reproach at such extravagance, and produced a limping excuse. "I don't have that sort of money on me, I'm afraid," I said. The dealer was quick as a ferret. "I got an agreement with the lady in the shop behind," he said. "She can take a credit card." There are times when the only decent response to the presence of fate is kindly to acknowledge it and give in. I gave in and produced a credit card. I signed the chit, and the dealer, pleased, put my purchase in a big bag. The bag was very heavy. Dick and I carried it between us until a taxi appeared. When we got back to Camden, my sister asked, "Is there a funeral?" I said no, I had just spent money I shouldn't have, and I was going to be in trouble. We had a good look at the machine, and Dick fetched an oil can. I lubricated all the bits that looked as though they would move. We lifted the machine onto the gas stove in the kitchen, and Dick lit the gas under the longer of the 2 cylinders, the one with a frill on its neck. For a while nothing happened, save that the thing got hotter. There was a burning smell. The cylinder under the gas flame began to turn red, and we both became apprehensive. The machine gave a twitch. Then, slowly at first, the flywheel began to turn. The piston rods moved in and out, and the speed gradually increased. It was soon spinning merrily and starting to shake, though not much, for the flywheel was evidently well balanced. It ran faster and faster, and eventually we felt we really ought to turn the gas off. Dick leaned back and wiped his hands with a rag. "Well, so, that's a Stirling engine. How does it work? Why does it go round?" "I've no idea," I said. I did meet some domestic resistance, but not much. At least the engine was small and not smelly like some of the things I brought into the house from time to time. Having bought a Stirling engine and shown it working to some of my friends, I was moved to find out something about it, especially as regards that question of how it worked, which was what everyone wanted to know. I bought a few books and borrowed others. The Internet was in its infancy at that time, so instant answers were not available as they are now. Over time, I came to some sort of understanding of why the wheel went round, and, being a lazy sort of person, was more or less satisfied. Some of the books about it had been written by amateurs, and were reasonably accessible to a person of my level of understanding, but the more technical works were well beyond me. It seemed that most folk who knew a lot about Stirling engines would, at the drop of a hat, go off into discussions of thermodynamics where I couldn't follow them, mainly because their disquisitions were couched in mathematical equations and assumed a knowledge of physics which was well beyond my first-year university course of 30 years before. From time to time over the next decade or two I would pick up one of the books again, or buy another one. The maths didn't become any more transparent, but I did get an inkling that there was more going on than just mechanical curiosity. There was some mystery about the engine. Why had it been so popular, and why had it vanished? There were thousands of them in the 19th century, but they disappeared in the 20th. And there seemed to be something which nobody could quite explain about how it worked. What was it? And what had it to do with the town of Stirling, if anything? I had read that the engine was invented by a man of that name in Kilmarnock, a town in Ayrshire of which I knew next to nothing, save that Rabbie Burns, Scotland's national poet and bad role model for Scottish boys, had lived nearby and spent a lot of time there drinking with his pals. Now, I am Scottish, born and bred, and members of my family have lived in Scotland for 500 years that I know about. There were some very bad ones, which is why I know about them. Yet until fairly recently I had never heard of a Stirling engine. This, in a small, boastful country which is much given to reminding the world of how many famous people have been born here. Nobody I knew had heard of a Stirling engine either, and I know a lot of people. Since the mathematics seemed to be a barrier to my fully understanding how the thing worked, or to not quite understanding how it worked, I decided to find out what I could about the people who had been connected with it. They turned out to be astonishing, and had some even more astonishing connections. Stirling himself was a bit of an enigma. He had left no letters, and lived a perfectly blameless life as a minister of the Kirk of Scotland, so little was known about him, except for the great Strathbogie controversy, of which more later. The only research which had been done on his life had been done by people who knew next to nothing about Scots history or culture, especially Scots culture in that crucial time at the start of the 19th century, when Stirling invented his engine. So there was work to be done. Once I had started down that road, the Stirling associations came fast and thick. First, there was Sir George Cayley, who had invented an aeroplane before there were even railways. Then came John Ericsson, a Swedish-American who became a national hero of his adopted homeland, or at least of the federal part of it in the Civil War, and whose fellow Swedes sank the greatest warship ever built. Only in make-believe, but they could have done it for real. One chap, John Malone, who is an important part of the story, was notorious as a knife fighter before he became an engineer, while another, H. Rinia, allowed the Nazis to steal the engine, knowing they would make nothing of it, and then reinvented the thing. But it wasn't until I read about NASA's New Horizons probe passing Pluto that I came across the name William Beale, an inspired and brilliant American who, for tough-minded saintliness, is up there with Stirling, and whose take on the engine was to send it to the stars. The little engine I had bought on the Portobello Road was throwing up a lot of questions. Chapter 1. Robert Stirling. The summer was bad that year, and it was bad all over. There were frosts in the spring, and in some places there was snow in June. There was frost again in August, and the crops rotted in the fields. Farmers who had poor harvests thought themselves fortunate, for most had no harvest at all. The wheat crop failed, so did the potato. Even the oats, that hardy cereal which had evolved in northern climes, were mostly not worth the trouble of raising from the mud in which they lay. The sun was rarely seen, and when it was blood-red. The rain never seemed to stop. It was the worst summer by far in nearly 2,000 years. The date was 1816, and the whole of the northern hemisphere was affected. The weather had been bad for some years past. Most people had eaten their reserves of corn, and there was nothing left. Famine crawled the land. Across Europe, Russia, China, and North America, people and livestock died. More in some places than in others, but everywhere there was distress. The cause, as we now know, was a series of volcanic eruptions from 1812 onward, culminating in the eruption, or rather the disintegration, of Mount Tambora in what is now Indonesia. It was the biggest blast in recorded history, bigger by far than the sum of all the nuclear explosions since 1945. An aerosol of sulfur compounds was hurled into the stratosphere. The sunlight was dimmed and global temperatures dropped by about 1 degree centigrade. That is a lot more serious than it sounds. In an age of widespread belief in supernatural agency, people understandably applied to their god or gods for relief, though none seemed disposed to help. In the Leigh Kirk in the town of Kilmarnock in Scotland, the congregation looked on the bright side and thanked the Lord that their church had been rebuilt a few years before, and at least the roof kept out the eternal rain. But, being good Calvinists, they regarded the foul weather as divine retribution for their, or at least for their fellows', sins. Such views were becoming less common among the more educated part of the populace due to the influence of Enlightenment rationality in the preceding half-century. But even in the less evangelical churches, a great many people clung to the notion that by amending their evil ways, or more commonly by persuading their fellows to amend theirs, they might induce the deity which governed the universe to suspend the operation of causality in their favor. In this they showed a certain lack of perspective, which is not uncommon in religious congregations of all denominations. The idea that the deity might be persuaded to undo the effects of a few million tons of Mount Tambora dispersed in the stratosphere, in return for improved behavior on the part of the townsfolk of Kilmarnock, seems disproportionate from our standpoint. It was not apparently from theirs. Prayers were offered up for better weather, and promises of amendment were made. In fairness to the Almighty, it must be admitted that the Kilmarnock folk didn't keep their side of the bargain, so they couldn't really complain. No doubt the promises were sincere at the time they were made, but the minute book of the Leigh Kirk session for the following year suggests otherwise. It shows the number of children born out of wedlock to have been slightly greater than before. The minute book implies that there was little sin in Kilmarnock other than fornication. Since this would be viewed more tolerantly today, perhaps the Almighty's reluctance to reverse the Mount Tambora event is understandable. In 1816, the Kirk of Scotland was not short of ministers ready to attribute failed harvests to human sinfulness, but their number was diminishing with the entry to the profession of young clergymen who had imbibed the philosophical and religious precepts of the later 18th century. The young man, who had recently been called to the second charge in the Leigh Kirk, was one of the latter. His name was Robert Stirling. His tenancy of the position was proposed in June and ratified in September. By the time he took up his duties, the dire condition of the country had become very obvious. We know from his actions and his later sermons that his inclination was rather to address a problem than to blame it on divine retribution for supposed immorality. Even so, what he did next was rather surprising. A week after his ordination, he lodged an application to patent a device which would later be called a heat exchanger. The purpose of the heat exchanger was to economize in the use of coal in furnaces by using the waste heat from the furnace flue to heat the air coming into the fire. A fire which is supplied with hot air burns hotter than one which has to heat the incoming air. It did this by doing what heat exchangers have done ever since. The cold incoming air is made to flow past the outgoing gas, smoke, etc., with only a thin wall between them. The heat is conducted through the wall from the latter to the former. It works both as a heater and as a cooler, depending on your point of view. The radiator of your car is a heat exchanger in which the heat from the engine cooling water passes through thin tubes and is transferred to the air which blows through it. Your central heating boiler passes the heat from burning oil or gas to the water which heats the radiators. The latter are also heat exchangers, since they transfer the heat from the water to the air of the room. The Stirling heat exchanger invention was later to become important in the development of the steel industry, and on that account alone the new minister of Kilmarnock Kirk may lay claim to a place in industrial history. But it is with the second part of the patent application that we are concerned, for it describes an engine which, using modifications of his invention, might be applied to moving machinery. The application includes a drawing of the engine and, from this, as well as the text of the application, it is apparent that Mr. Stirling had more things in mind in the years preceding his ordination than theology and divinity. Robert Stirling knew about bad harvests, for he had been a farm boy. Clogue Farm, where he was born in the parish of Methven near Perth, lies on the south-facing slope of the Grampian Mountains, overlooking the valley of the River Erne. The farm is still there today, as is the grey stone farmhouse, which is almost certainly his birthplace. It is a fine, if modest, stone house set in tall, mature timber, prosperous, but without ostentatious signs of affluence. The Stirlings were an extended family of middle-class agriculturists whose farms were strung across that southerly slope from Stirling to Perth. They were mostly tenant farmers, but nonetheless possessed of capital sufficient to stock and work a farm, which put them well above the laboring classes both socially and economically. And the family was cohesive, each member being aware of the number and extent of his or her relations. Among lowland families there was no formal clan structure such as that which prevailed in the Highlands, which began only a few miles north of Strathern, but the Scots were notorious for their pride in and adhesion to family. The land which his father farmed had been mostly forest as little as a century earlier, and what had not been woodland was bog. But from the early 18th century a spirit of inventiveness and a habit of rational exploitation of possibilities of improvement had led to a huge increase in the fertility and productiveness of the land, and a rising population in growing towns and cities provided markets for agricultural produce. It was a virtuous circle which made possible the developments in science and technology which were shortly to produce the second stage of the Industrial Revolution. By the time Stirling was born in 1790, Clogue Farm had introduced new crops, some from overseas, which had been selectively bred to produce higher yields than the old varieties. Methods of tillage had changed, and machinery had reduced the need for human or animal muscle in planting, harvesting, and processing. The machinery was mainly made of wood and would be barely recognizable as machinery today, but the principles on which it operated were coming to be understood throughout the farming community. Stirling's grandfather was reputed to have invented a threshing machine, probably horse-powered, which separated the seed from the stalk and replaced the ancient flail. Machinery was driven by water, wind, or animal power. The steam engines, which had become common in industry by the time of Robert's birth, were too big and too expensive for farm or village use. In 1790, in the village of Methven, which lay at the foot of the slope below Clogue, there were several mills. The term mill may be misleading here, implying as it does buildings of the dark satanic variety. Village mills were not like that. They tended to consist of cottages, in one end of which the operative pursued his or her craft, while the family lived in the other end, an arrangement sanctioned by tradition but with cattle replaced by loom or spinning wheels. But they did contain machinery of however simple a sort. The two-handed spinning wheel introduced in 1770 doubled the productivity of the spinner, thanks to a device which, though easy to make and to handle, introduced people to the notion that mechanical innovation might greatly increase their prosperity. As a consequence, young Robert grew up in a society whose fabric was shot through with the idea that life could be improved by the application of energy and ingenuity. At the age of 15, young Stirling went from Clogue to Edinburgh, probably on foot, a matter of 50 miles or so. In those days, most people did not stray far from home for most of their lives, and unless they were wealthy, those who did walked. That he went equipped with a high degree of literacy we know. He probably attended Perth Academy, which is some 5 miles distant from Clogue, a fine school open to boys of any social class, with a progressive curriculum which, besides the traditional ancient languages, taught contemporary subjects such as scientific navigation. Alas, the archives of Perth Academy do not go back far enough, so we know little of his school days. But we do have some evidence of Robert's reading from a most curious institution, which today is little changed from when Robert visited it to borrow books. About 15 miles from Methven lies Innerpeffry Library. This is no ordinary urban library. It lies deep in Perthshire farmland, not far from the town of Crieff. At the end of an avenue of trees stand some ancient buildings which house the oldest lending library in Scotland. There have been church buildings on the site since at least the 14th century, but none used as such after the Reformation. From medieval times the land had been in the hands of the Drummonds, another of the extensive lowland families, but much richer and grander than the Stirlings, counting peers, an earl, and later a duke among their number. David Drummond, the third Lord Maderty, who died in 1692, had left instructions in his will that his library remain at Innerpeffry, and 2 years later a charity, the Innerpeffry Mortification, which is still in existence today, was established to care for the collection. Since the books were almost all to do with astrology, religion, witchcraft, and demonology, this was scarcely a great contribution to human understanding. But by the standards of the time they were regarded as scholarly. Things improved with the addition of the collection of the Reverend Robert Hay Drummond half a century later, and by the time Robert Stirling was of age, most of the works of scholarship and science of the later 18th century were available. And, astonishingly, given the period, they were available to be borrowed by local people of little or no social standing. All that was required was that the borrower sign the borrower's register, giving their name and place of residence. That borrower's register is in existence today and may be inspected on application to the librarian. In the volume for 1806, when he was 16 years old, the register carries Robert's signature and his place of residence, Clogue, to evidence his borrowing first Buffon's Natural History, presumably not all 36 volumes, more likely John Leslie's translation, for which see later. Then Gibbons's Decline and Fall, and later Robertson's History of America, scarcely convenient additions to the college curriculum. These works are no light literature. Robert Stirling was plainly a serious-minded young man. So though there is little record of Robert's early life, we know that he went up to Edinburgh University equipped with an impressive spread of information. The Edinburgh to which Stirling traveled was an extraordinary place. At the beginning of this century it had been a narrow, straight-laced parochial town, introverted and governed by an exclusive and self-serving town council. By the century's end, it would become a society which people, not its own, would compare seriously with the...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?